Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation and entrepreneurship. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you authors, corporate innovation managers, entrepreneurs, and above all else, thought leaders on the topics of innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you successfully navigate your innovation journey. Every Monday, I'll bring you a world-class thought leader such as Steve Blank, Alex Osterwalder, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, or Whitney Johnson, just to name a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you some quick digestible insights myself to help end your week on a high before you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is proudly brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub, school, and consultancy that works with large organizations to help them adopt the mindset, methodologies, and tools required to explore new business models and disruptive innovation in an era of rapid change. If your organization needs support coming up with ideas, testing and turning those ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit Collective Campus online at www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. This episode of Future Squared is brought to you by Spigot, the largest provider of innovation management software to some of the world's foremost companies, including the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, Westpac, CSIRO, Westfield, AT&T, Citi, Coca-Cola, MetLife Insurance, Pfizer, Sprint, Unilever, and many more. Spigot has powered innovation and process improvement for large enterprises, enabling them to engage with their employees, customers, and partners to build a culture of innovation. Spigot is recognized by both Gartner and Forrester as the leader in the innovation management sector. For a limited time, listeners of Future Squared can get 10% of Spigot's innovation management platform. Taking advantage of this offer is super easy. Simply sign up for a demo at futuresquared.xyz/Spigot. That's SPIGIT. And now for today's episode. Welcome back to Future Squared. Today I'll be speaking with Paul Smith. He's a popular keynote speaker and corporate trainer in leadership and storytelling techniques, a former executive and 20-year veteran of the Procter Gamble Company, and the author of 3 books: Sell with a Story, How to Capture Attention, Build Trust and Close the Sale; Lead with a Story, a guide to crafting business narratives that captivate, convince and inspire; and Parenting with a Story, real-life lessons in character for parents and children to share. He can be found at leadwithastory.com. Paul's work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, Success, Forbes, The Washington Post, PR News, CIO Magazine, Investors Business Daily, Marketing Research Magazine, the American Banking Journal, and London's Edge Magazine, among others. In his 20 years with Procter Gamble, Paul held leadership positions in both research and finance functions, and most recently served as Director of Consumer and Communications Research. Prior to P&G, Paul was a consultant for the Arthur Andersen Company. So with that, it gives me much pleasure to introduce you to the one and only Paul Smith. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Hey, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program, and you're joining us all the way from Ohio, USA.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right. I was just hoping I could find myself in Australia at some point. As I mentioned, I haven't had the opportunity to be there yet.
Yeah, well, I understand Australia and Antarctica are the 2 places, or the 2 continents you're yet to visit.
That's right. That's right. And like I said, I'm very eager to visit at least one of those 2, but I'll leave that to your guests to determine which that is.
Well, I'm sure our guests will, I don't know. Like I was saying, Antarctica, it could be a positive thing, jumping out of your comfort zone, cold weather, maybe building an igloo. They're all life skills that I'm sure some of us would love to develop over the long term. But
I suppose so.
Nonetheless, we digress from today's topic of conversation. So, look, congratulations are in order. Your book, your 3rd book, Sell with a Story, peaked at number 1 on Amazon's sales and marketing chart. So congratulations.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was very happy to have my 15 minutes of fame or 15 hours or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
That's great.
No, fantastic. And I guess before we get into the book, a little bit about yourself. I mean, you spent about 20 years with Procter Gamble. You held various leadership positions, and as we said before the show kicked off, all roads lead to Ohio. If you're in the company for that long, and that's where the headquarters of the company are based, so therefore senior executive roles are all in Ohio. But you've spent a bit of time all over the country, and I guess given that you spent such a long time in the company, keen to find out what it was like striking out on your own to launch your company, Storymakers. And,
Mhm.
I imagine it would have been quite challenging to jump into the unknown after spending, 20 years in the familiarity and the comfort of a company like P&G.
Yeah, it was. In fact, at the time I was probably 45, almost 46 years old. So
Mm,
definitely too young to retire. And, I've still got young kids and college funds to build and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, it was definitely a difficult decision. And, but looking back, absolutely one of the best decisions I've ever made, and
mm.
ended up finding myself here doing something that I absolutely love to do, both the research and the writing I do on the books and speaking to audiences all over the world. So I consider myself quite fortunate to have figured out a way to do what I love and get paid for it.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely great. And I guess we've interviewed a few people, Whitney Johnson, the author of Disrupt Yourself, and Jenny Blake, the author of Pivot, who all talk about how you can, essentially not perform a full 180, but maybe a 90-degree shift where you take your
Ah,
existing skills and you apply them in a different way. And
yeah,
in your case, you spent 20 years in P&G in the senior executive roles, learned a lot. It's not as if you completely threw out the baby with the
right.
bathwater. You had the skills and you just applied them to growing your own sort of business.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, I didn't end up, going into skydiving or become a professional
Mm.
football player or something totally unrelated. But it did take, some thinking and planning and prodding and luck. I'll have to admit to get where I am.
Yeah, luck. What do they say about luck? It's the intersection of hard work and timing.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment. Yeah.
Fantastic. So Paul, I guess there's a lot of talk today about storytelling, especially in marketing circles, and I mean, oftentimes it can be a bit eye roll inducing because it's not often backed up with actual practical advice on how you get from A to B, and that's where your book is different because you provide a lot of practical insights on how to actually sell with a story, and just for our audiences information. Sell with a Story is your third book, and it's a follow up to Lead with a Story and Parenting with a Story. So I guess just let's roll it back a bit. How did the book come about?
Yeah. So you mean the first one or this
The
most
third,
recent one?
Sell with a Story.
Yeah. So, well, quite honestly, it was my publisher's idea. So, the first two books were my idea, and sold that into the publisher. And after the second one was out a little while, the suggestion came to me from them and said, "We like what we are seeing. We're kind of creating a brand franchise here, and we're looking for what would be the next big idea in the storytelling space, and we think it would be." For salespeople, and that's just their assessment of the marketplace for books and who reads books and needs books, and where they think storytelling could be best leveraged. So on their side, that was their suggestion. The reason I agreed to do that is because I was hearing the same thing on my side. So I have clients all over the world who hire me to come teach their leadership and executives how to be better leaders through storytelling. And one type of group that I consistently have contact me and ask me to come speak to them are sales teams. So individual sales teams or sales conferences will often have me, come and be the keynote speaker at a sales conference where there are people in sales from all kinds of different companies and industries. And so I was seeing a pattern here, and it just became clear that salespeople in general, they already are pretty good storytellers, but they recognize more than perhaps most groups how critical storytelling is to their personal success and ability to get their job done. Whereas it's not as obvious if you're an engineer or a human resources manager or a researcher or something else. But salespeople, I think, recognize that they need to be great storytellers. So those combination of those two things made me very quickly kind of accept that challenge.
And I guess your book provides a lot of insights on how to use story to build rapport, influence people, and ultimately sell a product or service. And I mean, not even selling a product or service, but I guess as professionals or as human beings, even, I mean, we're always having to convince someone to come around to our point of view on a particular topic or influence someone in some way, shape, or form. So, I mean, how does effective storytelling help us do that?
Yeah, so well, a couple of things in that. First of all, I think you're right. It's not just salespeople that need to use storytelling to be more
Mm,
influential. All of us are essentially salespeople in some, in some form or fashion. I mean, when you were 5 years old and you heard the ice cream truck, driving by, and you ran into to mom and dad to get 25 cents to go buy an ice cream cone.
hmm
You became a salesperson at that moment, right? You had to convince mom or dad why they should give you, a quarter to go get that ice cream.
hmm
So, and it is that way as we're adults as well, and we're leading organizations, or we're having to try to get our boss to approve a recommendation, or to get somebody to give us a raise, or to hire us for a job. Or, I mean, we're constantly selling either ourselves or our ideas,
hmm
or if you're a salesperson, literally a product or service. So, absolutely, the skill set is going to help everybody, no matter what it says on your business card. But I did very clearly um, dedicate and focus the book for professional salespeople. And most of the research I did for the book was among professional salespeople and professional buyers. So, professional procurement managers who do nothing all day long but meet with salespeople
mm
and decide what to buy and what not to. In other words, which sales stories worked on them and which ones didn't. So after interviewing, like I said, sales and procurement people at probably 50 different companies around the world. So like Microsoft and Costco and Abercrombie and Fitch and Hewlett Packard and Kroger and Amway and even Children's Hospital in Los Angeles and companies in all kinds of industries. I ended up finding out that salespeople are telling stories across the entire spectrum of the sales process, from
mm
as early as when they introduce themselves to a buyer or a prospect, to preparing themselves for the sales call, to building rapport, as you mentioned earlier, to making the actual sales pitch itself, and then to handling objections, and then to closing the sale, and even managing customer relationships after the sale, and building loyalty and things like that. So I was very pleasantly surprised to see it being used in all of those areas.
mm.
Um, and what I was looking for, of course, was, what stories are these salespeople telling?
Yeah.
When are they telling them, and are they effective? And I ended up reverse engineering my way into what is it that made an effective sales story, and what is it that did not.
Excellent. And I guess, I mean, a lot of people say that buyers are far more likely to buy from someone who they consider a friend, someone they've built that rapport
Hmm.
with. And you've been quoted as saying that story is the shortest distance between being a stranger and a friend. And you touched on a few great points there, that salespeople or effective salespeople tell stories throughout the entire life cycle, from the initial contact even through to aftercare, after a customer has bought a product.
Hmm.
So, what do some of those effective stories look like? I guess, especially when it comes to building that initial rapport.
Yeah. So the like you said, it's best if I mean, people want to buy from friends, of course, but you don't have to be a personal friend of a
No.
salesperson or of a buyer to sell them something. But they do need to like you,
Mm,
or at least get to know you a little bit. And like you quoted there, stories are that shortest distance between being a stranger and a friend, because you could read somebody your resume,
hmm
and it wouldn't help them get to know you very well. But you tell them one story about something that happened to you as a child, or when you were in college, or at your last job or something, and now they can empathize with you a little bit, and they feel like they've walked in your shoes for a brief moment, and so they feel like they know you. And
Yeah.
and, and literally, there have been studies that show that, human beings naturally distrust people they don't know, and we naturally trust people that we do know. And so that one story kind of moves you from the distrusted circle to the trusted circle, just because they feel like they know you a little bit better. Now, if you give them reason to not believe you, if you're dishonest with them, of course, then they'll stop trusting you. But the story moves you into that zone of natural trust, and that's where you want to be, and want to stay there.
Yeah.
So the kind of stories would be stories about why it is that you do what you do, and stories that will convince them and help them illustrate for them that if you make a mistake, you'll let them know about it, that they'll hear about it from you. Or stories to help them understand that if it comes down to a disagreement between you and their company, sometimes they're going to go to bat for you. They will actually take your fight back to their corporate chain of command,
hmm
and go to battle for you. Or it could be very more straightforwardly stories about the founding of their company. How did their company get founded? Stories that will communicate how they're different from their competitors. So those are all like types of stories that you might tell in that rapport building area before you've ever started a sales pitch. You know, you haven't heard anything yet that talks about the product that we're selling or the service we're selling or why you should buy. I mean, these are all rapport building type stories that can happen over the course of hours or weeks or months or years, you know, in between and largely before you get into the main sales pitch.
Yeah, and I guess it's about distinguishing yourself from just being a salesperson. I mean, by telling these stories, you're going to morph from just another salesperson into a human being. And if you want to effectively build a relationship with someone, or at least get them to like you, you need to appear as a human being and not just another person in a suit trying to sell something.
Right. Yeah. And you asked me to help explain this. Would it help if I gave you an example?
That would be great.
Yeah. So an example to distinguish between a sales pitch and a sales story as I define it. So, I mean, a sales pitch, you know, if I started out a phone call with you and I said, look, Steve, there are 3 reasons why you need to buy my books, right? So here's reason number one, number 2, number 3, whatever. I mean, that's a sales pitch. I'm giving you reasons to buy what it is that I'm selling. But if I start out, you know, let me tell you about something that happened to me yesterday. Now I'm telling you a story, right? You can tell because a story has a time and a place, and there's a main character, and that main character has a goal, and there are obstacles, and so it literally it's a narrative about something that happened to somebody, as opposed to the way story, that word story, is often used today to mean all kinds of things, including a sales pitch or just a really great presentation or a really compelling argument. People will call that a story, and that's not the kind of storytelling I'm talking about. I'm talking about real stories. So, for example, and this one actually happened to me, or that I heard myself, that made me buy something. Last summer, my wife and I were at an art fair, and she was looking for a picture for our son's bathroom at home. And she got to this one booth of this underwater photographer, this guy named Chris Guggen. He just does these mesmerizing underwater pictures of sea anemones and coral reefs and sea turtles and stuff like that. And she got attached to this one picture that to me looked about as out of place as a pig in the ocean. And the reason is because it was literally a picture of a pig in the ocean. And I just thought that was the silliest thing. And when I finally got my chance to ask the artist a question about it, you know, I said, dude, you know, what's with the pig in the ocean? And he said, oh, yeah, it was the craziest thing. And by the way, this is the moment that the magic started. He said, yeah, it was the craziest thing. That picture was taken off the coast of this uninhabited island in the Bahamas called Big Major K. And he said, apparently what happened was a few years ago, some local entrepreneur decided he wanted to raise a pig farm for bacon, I guess. And so he bought all these pigs. But he found this island, uninhabited island, where he could keep them for free. So, of course, he throws them out there. And he said, but if you notice in the picture up on the beach of the island, there's really not much more than cactus up there growing. And he said, that's obviously a problem, right? Because pigs don't like cactus. And he said, so they weren't thriving. And he said the good news was what they realized pretty quickly was some local restaurant owner on one of the neighboring islands would boat his kitchen refuse over to Big Major K every night and dump it a few dozen yards offshore. And so pretty soon these hungry little pigs smell this food that's, you know, a few dozen yards off the beach. And so they finally get hungry enough and brave enough that they kind of wade out there and, you know, dog paddle or pig paddle, I guess. You know, eventually they figure out how to get out there to the food. You know, the first 1 pig, then 2 pigs, you know, 3 pigs. Now it's several generations later, and all the pigs on this island know how to swim. And he said, in fact, when I got there in my boat, I didn't even have to get all the way to shore. These pigs, when they see a boat coming, they think they're going to get fed, and they start swimming out to the boat. He said, I just leaned over and stuck my camera in the water and took a picture. And, you know, normally I've got to put my scuba equipment on, and it's a, you know, 2-hour process and a big ordeal, and, you know, easiest picture I ever took. So, of course, at that point, you know, I've already got my credit card out, and I'm like, we'll take it. Sold. Completely sold right now. Right. And ask yourself why. You know, 2 minutes earlier, that picture was worth nothing to me. But after hearing that story, now I had to have it. And it was worth whatever he wanted to charge me almost, because now I wasn't just buying a silly picture. I was buying a story with a picture with it instead of a picture with a story with it. And it was this wonderful story that I love to tell, and I get to tell people when they come to my house. And it's an animal psychology lesson and a history lesson and a geography lesson kind of all rolled into one. So the story literally adds value to the product that you're selling.
Yeah.
And so that's an example, and just one example of 25 different types of sales stories that I've kind of documented. And that one I call a value adding story. So
Yeah.
it's a story that literally makes the thing you're selling more valuable.
And I guess one thing you did when you were telling that story, Paul, was you built the anticipation. And you kept me kind of on the edge of my seat wanting to hear about these swimming pigs and how they
Right.
learned to swim, what they were doing in the water, and so on.
Right.
Rather than giving away the ending up front, you kind of
Exactly.
kept it in suspense. And I guess to that point, I mean, what are some of the other, I suppose, essential elements of telling a good story that just captivates the listener?
Yeah, well, so that's definitely one of them, and I call that the structure of the story. So we're all taught, I think, as we get out into the business world, or even maybe before that in college, or gosh, now that I'm thinking about it, it's probably all the way back to elementary school when you're first taught how to make a presentation, or if you're going to give a book report at school, or whatever it is that you got 20 minutes in front of an audience, and you've got to convince them of something. We've all been taught, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them, right? It's basically introduction, body, conclusion. And we write memos at work, and the recommendation is up front. In fact, it's in the subject line of the email or of the memo. I recommend we do this. And now here are my 5 reasons why.
Mhm.
And that is the right structure for a presentation or for a memo or for an email.
Mhm.
But that's not the right structure for a story. Right? Imagine if you were to watch the very first Star Wars movie and you found out in the first 5 minutes that Darth Vader was Luke Skywalker's dad and that Princess Leia was his sister. I mean, it would totally ruin the story,
Mhm.
right? So stories have a very different structure than presentations and memos. And if you use the same structure, the memo structure in a story, you completely ruin it. So the proper structure is context, challenge, conflict, and resolution. And there are lots of different story structures, and this is just the one that I prefer and is the simplest for me to teach to my audiences. But the point is that at the beginning of it is the context and the background.
Mhm.
The challenge and the conflict and the struggle is in the middle, and then how it resolves itself, how it turns out in the end is at the end. It's not at the beginning. And then after you've done that, that's when you deliver. And the lesson I learned from it was this. And that's why I think what you should do is that. So the lesson and the recommended action comes at the end, not at the beginning, right? So and if you don't do it that way, then you just have to admit to yourself that you're not telling a story. What you're doing is making a presentation or making a sales pitch or and then those things are fine. It's fine to do those things, but if you want it to actually be a story, you have to use a story structure.
Yeah.
So that's one thing, is structure, but there are all kinds of other things, and we can get into as much detail as you want, but emotion is important, and the element of surprise is important, and using dialogue and the right level of details, and it's got to be the right length. These are, I basically have a chapter on each of these things in the book. How long should a sales story be? Should it be 10 minutes long or 15 minutes long? No, it should be 2 minutes long, it turns out. So, and that's very important, because if you try and tell a 15-minute sales story, you probably get thrown out of the office at about minute 7.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you touched on an amazing point there, which is around story versus information. So if it's a memo or a presentation, it's purely informational. Yes, you want to keep people engaged, but selling a story, or telling a story rather, serves a very different purpose. And just on context, challenge, conflict, and resolution. Are you able to provide or elaborate on those particular steps in the structure, particularly around challenge and conflict?
Yeah. So probably the easiest way, especially kind of in an audio format like we're in here, for your listeners to visualize this is to the questions that their story needs to answer and the order in which they need to answer it. And I think there are 8 questions that all stories need to answer. And here they are, and in the proper order. The first question is, why should I listen to this story? You as the person talking or writing needs to answer that question for the audience. And if you don't answer that question in the first 2 or 3 sentences, they might not listen to the rest of your story.
Yeah.
They might either physically walk out or mentally or emotionally check out, right? So that's the first question you've got to answer. Then the questions are, where and when did it take place? Who's the main character and what did they want? And that's the context, by the way. Those two questions: where and when did it take place, and who's the main character, and what did they want to accomplish?
Mm-hmm.
Then you're into the challenge, which is what was the problem or opportunity they ran into. So that's the next question: what was the problem or opportunity they ran into?
Mm-hmm.
Then you're into the conflict, which is what did they do about it? What did they do about this problem or opportunity? Did they fight a bad guy? Did they acquiesce? Did they seize on the opportunity? What did they do?
Mm-hmm.
And then the resolution answers one of the latter questions, which is how did it turn out in the end? Right? So that gets you through the main part of the story. But then the last two questions of the 8 are what you do after you've told the story, which is what did you learn from it? And what do you think I should do now? Right. So those are the 8. And by the way, that first one, why should I listen to this story? I call that the hook. Right? That is the, half a sentence or one sentence at the very beginning that gets your audience's attention and lets them know that if they will listen to you for the next 2 minutes, they're going to learn something very important to them, not to you, but to them. And if you don't have a good hook at the beginning, they might not listen to that rest of that story. So those are the 8 questions I think you need to answer. And if you don't answer some of them, or if you don't answer them in the right order, it really freaks out your listener. I mean, imagine if I told you a story and I didn't tell you where and when it happened. And imagine it was just a fabulous, fabulous story. Halfway through, you're thinking, wait a minute, did this really happen? This sounds too good to be true, or this just sounds too fantastic. And the natural questions that you're going to want to ask me is, one is, did this really happen? But two is, if the answer is yes, really, where was this? Or when did this happen? Mm-hmm. Right? Your mind needs and yearns to have those two questions, where and when did this happen? And if you don't answer it, it nags at your audience through the rest of your story, and they might not be paying very good attention to your story until you answer those two questions. Then they can go, oh, okay, it's probably real. The guy just told me where and when it happened, so it's probably legit. Now I can relax and listen to the rest of the story. But if you skip that, or if you don't give it to them until the end, that's the danger that you run into. And that's why these questions are important, and they're important to be answered in this order.
Yeah, and if I think about the pig farming story that you told a few moments
Mm-hmm.
ago,
Mm-hmm.
the why should I listen was, well, because I wanted to find out the story about the pig in the water, essentially.
Right.
The where was
Right.
The Bahamas. The main characters was the pig farmer, the photographer. The problem was
Right.
that the pigs didn't eat the cactus.
Yep.
And then
Exactly.
what was done about it? You had the restaurateur dumping scraps into the ocean, and therefore the pigs learnt how to swim, and that's how their particular problem was resolved. And then you learnt why the pigs were in the water by the end of it.
Right.
And what done now?
Exactly.
Well, you were ultimately inspired to buy the painting. So
Exactly.
yeah,
You nailed it.
interesting. It's a very interesting formula, and I can see how. And just thinking about stories that either I've told or I've listened to, where someone's telling a story, and after a few moments, you've got all these questions in your head about, well, who are the main characters? Where did this take place?
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't flow as well if some of those elements are missing.
Right, or not in the right order, and you can deliver some things out of the proper order, but you need to do it smartly and know what you're doing. In fact, I give a number of pieces of advice for where you can stray from this format and actually make the story even more powerful. But it's only a few places, and you need to know what you're getting into when you take a risk like that.
And just for the purpose of our or for the benefit of our audience, rather, I mean, most of our audience are corporate executives involved with product development, innovation, sales, and so on. And I know your book draws on case studies from companies such as Microsoft, Costco, Xerox, Abercrombie and Fitch, and HP. Have you got a case study you can share with us on how effective storytelling has led to a sale?
Well, gosh, that's I suppose a little bit like asking, have you ever gone to the grocery store and come back with food? Yeah. I think just about every time almost every sales call, I think, probably has some storytelling going on. I mean, I did not run into any salespeople that told me I never tell stories when I'm in a sales call. So I think it's incredibly ubiquitous, and every not every single one, 90% of the stories in the book are examples of stories that did lead to a sale. So the Pig Island story I just told you is a sales story that led to a sale. I bought the Pig Island picture. Okay, so there's the answer to your question. There's one right there.
Yeah.
But all of the other examples in the book are examples where, not all, 90%. And I say that because the few that did not work are interesting in why they didn't work, and there's still something you can learn from them. But yeah, if you want another example, one of my favorites is a guy that works for a company that makes internet security protocol software, which is a mouthful of words, and I didn't really understand what it was until he explained it. But he's the guy that programs the stuff when you buy something online, that your credit card doesn't get stolen, or the bank, when you get money out of the bank, that somebody else doesn't get your money or your information. And when he goes and calls on banks and he's selling this programming software, what he normally does is tells them a story about him going to Las Vegas. He says, I was at a sales conference a couple of years ago in Vegas, and you know what you do in Vegas. You go to the conference during the day, you go have dinner, and then you got 2 or 3 hours or more to kill at night, and you go to the casinos, right? That's what you're in Vegas for. Yeah. So he said, I was out at the casinos, and I was winning some, and I was losing some, and I was winning some, and then I was losing some, and I was losing more, and I was losing more. And he said, eventually I ran out of cash, and I went to the money machine to get some more cash, and it denied my transaction. Oh. And I tried it again, and it denied my transaction. I went to another machine, and it denied my transaction. And he said, and I know what's going on. I live in New Jersey. All of a sudden, I'm in Las Vegas, 2,000 miles away. It's the middle of the night. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm getting a boatload of cash out of a machine. The bank thinks somebody stole my credit card. Mm-hmm. And he said, I'm glad they are looking out for problems like that. That's great. But he said what they did about it created a real problem for me. Mm-hmm. He said they called my wife at home in New Jersey at 4 o'clock in the morning, and woke her up. And can you imagine what that conversation must have sounded like on her end of the line? Well, I'm sorry, Mrs. Moulton, for waking you up at 4 o'clock in the morning, but your husband is in Las Vegas trying to get a boatload of cash out of a casino machine at 1 o'clock in the morning. Do you approve this transaction? He said, I was livid, and she was livid at me, and he said, so he says that kind of thing probably happens with your customers all the time. You don't even know it. And it may not be that particular problem, but it's some other problem when they're trying to do legitimate business with you, and your security protocols are not only not letting them do legitimate business with you, but it's causing problems in their life. And he said, my security protocols don't do that. I would do something smart, like send a text message to their cell phone with a temporary password, or ask a security question or whatever. And the smart things that most banks do nowadays, but they weren't doing it back then when he was doing this. Yeah. So he tells that story instead of just saying, well, surveys show that 37.4% of bank customers are slightly to greatly irritated at their banks when they have transactional problems at the ATM. Yeah. Okay, that's a nice piece of data, but hearing the story really makes it come alive. And
yeah.
So he has success. He'll tell that story, and almost always he will have a successful sale after that.
Yeah, and I love that you just touched on, the whole expert angle. 37.4%, et cetera, et cetera. And in light of a lot of political upheaval, I guess, this year, whether it was Brexit or whether it was Trump's victory in the election last week, Michael Gove, he was a British conservative who campaigned vociferously for Brexit. He essentially refused to name any economists who back Britain's exit from the European Union, basically saying that people in the country have had enough of experts. And ultimately, if you look at Brexit and I guess the US election, I think storytelling played a big role in appealing to the masses. What role do you think storytelling played as opposed to, say, economic or political reasoning and expert opinion?
Yeah, so I don't think I heard a lot of what I would call storytelling out of Donald Trump. The times that you're most likely to hear storytelling from politicians is during like the presidential State of the Union address. And I think Ronald Reagan kind of started this, but you'll notice every year at the State of the Union address, the president will invite 2 or 3 guests, and they'll be up there sitting next to their spouse. And he'll say, well, and joining us today up there is Bob Jones, and he's a farmer in Indiana, and he's been really struggling lately with whatever problem, and so that's why my plan to do this is, and he'll tell a short story about that particular real person and show how, his policies are going to help that person and people like that person.
Yeah.
And every president since then has been doing that, and I think they do a fabulous job of it, quite frankly. And you'll see that sometimes on the campaign trail, but I don't recall hearing Donald Trump use storytelling as an intentional technique in his stump speeches. He and I mean, now that I think about it, I don't know that Hillary Clinton did necessarily as much as well. It was mostly a bunch of I don't even want to call them facts, because on both sides there was a lot of things that are hard to call facts.
Yeah.
But I think there was a lot of appealing to emotion and appealing to fear. So I think there was a lot of that, and stories can do that for you. But I don't know that either of them were actually crafting stories to do that. They were just saying, I'll build a wall.
Yeah.
Because don't you want me to build a wall because you don't like the people on the other side of the wall? Or I'll kill all the bad guys so that ISIS doesn't take over. Well, that's not a story, but it's certainly appealing to emotion and fear and things like that, and that gets people to vote.
Yeah, yes. And I guess that's probably where I was more alluding to, the fact that saying things like that does appeal to some of, or does push some of those emotional buttons the same way a story perhaps would.
Yes, yes. I think they definitely were pushing those emotional buttons, but I don't think they were using what I would consider very good storytelling skills to do that. They were just using fear mongering.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. On a couple of other points I want to touch on, Paul, was, most of our audience, I suppose, enthusiasts when it comes to corporate innovation, and one of the challenges they often have is getting buy-in from senior management to do things differently, to run experiments and essentially change or challenge the status quo. What sort of advice do you have for people who are trying to overcome strong objections and sell stories to people who have way more power than they do?
Yeah. So whether you're trying to get your recommendations approved or you're trying to sell something, you're often going to run into some objections, right? So like, well, I don't like that idea because of X, Y, or Z, or the product you're selling is too expensive, or the quality is not good enough, or whatever. And when you run into objections like that, obviously one way to respond to them is just to refute them with the facts that you have at your disposal, if you think it's easily refutable. But often a more compelling way to refute that is with a story. And the story would be about somebody else who raised that same objection, and then after they bought the product anyway, realized, that problem never came to pass. I thought that was going to be a problem, but it turned out not to be. And so they can see themselves in that person and watch as that person goes through their day dealing with the product that they bought from you, or the problem that they were going to buy the product from you to fix. And they realize that was I raised that objection and I shouldn't have, because it really wasn't a problem after all. That's one way. And so what a lot of salespeople do is they will even tell those stories up front before the objection is even brought up. If it's an objection they get regularly, what they find is that it's better just to head it off and tell a story about somebody else who raised an objection and it turned out not to be true. Then that keeps their prospect or their buyer from even bringing up the objection to begin with.
Yeah, and I guess you're essentially telling a story to invalidate the objection.
Right. Yeah, but legitimately so. Tell the story about somebody who really did have that objection, and your product turned out not to be the problem that they thought it was going to be.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess in some instances you may not have that example of where somebody had the same objection. It could potentially be a completely new objection that you've never heard before,
right.
But I guess a lot of that would come with time out in the field. You spend enough time trying to sell something, you hear the same objection a million times.
Exactly. And that first time you hear that new objection, you may not have a story for it, but the next time you hear it, now you've got one that you've already heard. And if they bought your product and it turned out not to be a problem, now you do have a story. In fact, that's one of the things that I hope people take away from my book, is that you need to have a repertoire, a large repertoire of stories in your head and maybe on your computer or in a file cabinet somewhere, ready to bring out and use at a moment's notice.
Mm.
Just like you probably have lots and lots of data and facts and figures and analyses all over in your brain and on your computer and in file cabinets to pull out when you need it. You need to have lots of stories in your repertoire, in your database to pull out when you need it. And so I encourage people to intentionally go on story hunts to find the stories that you need. In fact, so there's a list of, there are 25 stories that I think just about every salesperson needs. And the list is in the book, and there's one example of each one in the book, and the list is at the end in the appendix, and it's your to-do list. After you're done reading this book, take this list, this blank list of 25 stories, and go fill in the blank. So you need each one of these types of stories, but you need to find your story that fits into number 13 and number 7 and number 21 and number 25. And once you've got those 25, now you really are prepared to have a lot more success now that you've got those 25 in your database. You're going to want more, but those are the ones you're going to want to start with.
No, definitely check that out and encourage all of our audience to do the same. And I guess a great point to wrap up on before we jump into our lightning round, Paul, would be creating a surprise ending. There's no shortage of Hollywood films and TV shows where an ending can completely take you by surprise, and it's something that you'll go on and tell your friends about, and wow, what an ending, totally didn't see that coming. What is the sort of dynamic or the formula behind a surprise ending?
Yeah. So two things. One, why it works, and then secondly, I'll teach you how to create one because it's really very simple. So the reason why it's so effective is that when you get surprised, your body releases a little bit of adrenaline in your system, and that adrenaline literally makes your memory processing in your brain more effective. Psychologists call it the memory consolidation period. After something happens, it takes a few seconds to a few minutes to process that memory into memory. And adrenaline literally makes that process more effective. So a surprise ending gets people to remember the lesson at the end of the story and the end of the story and the recommendation that comes with it better than they would have remembered it if you didn't have a surprise. So there's a very practical reason to have a surprise in a business story or a sales story. In a Hollywood movie, it's just entertaining. And it'll make your stories more entertaining as well. But there's a legitimate practical reason to have it in there as well. And the way to do it, like most stories don't naturally have a surprise, but there's a very simple technique. And I try in each of these chapters, whether it's emotion or surprise or dialogue or details or the structure, to give you techniques and tools to accomplish this. So for a surprise ending, it's very simple. And I'll just give you an example. So there's a young kid named James, 9 years old. He's in the kitchen with his mom and his mom's sister. Well, mom and auntie are at the table having a cup of tea. James is standing at the stove watching the tea kettle boil. And he's just fascinated. He's watching the steam come out of the tea kettle, and he's holding a spoon up into the jet of steam and watching it condense onto the spoon and drip down the handle and into a cup. And he's just watching that cycle go over and over and over. And he's just fascinated with it. And eventually his mom just barks at him. She's like, James, like, go do your homework or read a book or go outside and play or like go do something. Right? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? You're just wasting your time in here like this. Now, fortunately, young 9-year-old James was undaunted by his mother's admonition, because 20 years later, when he was 29 years old, and in the year 1765, James Watt reinvented the steam engine, ushering in, of course, the Industrial Revolution that we all benefit from today, and all because of the fascination with steam that he developed as a 9-year-old kid in his mom's kitchen. Now, the first time I read that story, it was in a book titled James Watt. It was a biography of the man who reinvented the steam engine. Okay, so of course it was no surprise to me that story in chapter 1 about 9-year-old James was about James Watt, inventor of the steam engine. The whole book was about James Watt. But to you and anybody listening to this podcast, it was a surprise, probably, at the end to find out it was James Watt, the guy that invented the steam engine. And the reason it was a surprise is simple. I didn't tell you his last name. I took something that was supposed to be delivered at the beginning of the story, one very important thing, his last name, and I didn't give it to you until the end of the story. Presto. Yeah. Surprise ending.
And even what you just spoke about a few moments ago with the adrenaline hit or the dopamine release, I could definitely, as soon as you mentioned who it was, I could, my face just lit up. There was this energy that came with that surprise ending, which was definitely noticeable.
Lovely. Yeah. So
Mm,
that's exactly what's supposed to happen. So I
yeah.
must have done it right.
You're a great storyteller. Okay, so look, Paul, I think we'll definitely include a lot of resources and links in our show notes for our listeners if they want to find out a little bit more about the book, access, those 25 stories they need to tell, all the elements that make up a story. So we'll make sure to share that for our listeners. But before we let you go, we've got to rope you into our lightning round. Are you
Uh-oh.
ready?
Are there any wrong answers?
There's never a wrong answer.
Okay. All right. Hit me.
Let's do this. So, usually we ask two hypotheticals and one on lifestyle design. So, question number one is, if you could work for any company at any stage of the company life cycle, who would it be and why?
Ooh. Uh, a lot of us would probably answer Apple Computer at the beginning, or maybe
Yeah.
Microsoft at the beginning. Guys, that's probably too trite of an answer.
Ah,
But the best I can come up with right now. So
yep.
maybe I'll stick with that.
Fantastic. Look, I would definitely opt for Apple Computer in the late
Yeah.
70s
Yeah.
in Wozniak's garage. But was it Wozniak's garage or Steve Jobs' garage? One or the other.
Yeah.
Question number two is, if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, Paul, who would it be and what would you ask?
Ooh. I'm kind of a science geek at heart, so I would
Hmm.
probably ask Isaac Newton, how he came up with the idea for the calculus, or got his first inspiration for his gravitational theory, or something geeky like that.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's a very, very quick off the mark as well. Usually people and ah for about 20 or 30 seconds before they come up with an answer. So good stuff, Paul. And lucky last is one on lifestyle design. I'm always keen on digging into the minds of high performers, thought leaders, authors, high achievers, and so on to find out how they manage their days, how they stay on top of their games. Do you have any daily sort of rituals or routines that you partake in, Paul?
Um, well, exercise, and that may be a trite one as well. I find I find that getting up and exercising, I don't drink coffee.
Hmm.
And I might be the only person listening to this that hears my voice that doesn't drink coffee. It just seems like it's a human need.
Hmm.
But I don't drink coffee. I don't drink anything with caffeine in it.
Hmm.
I don't smoke, so there's no nicotine. So I don't have any stimulants, chemical stimulants in my body. And most people I know just could not start their day without one of those stimulants.
Yeah.
And so to me, what that stimulant is exercise. So I get up the first thing, I exercise, I run a few miles, I lift weights, I do something like that. And that's what gets my blood, of course, circulating, and that gets me awake for the rest of the day.
Mm.
And if I didn't do that, I mean, that's my coffee.
Yeah.
So it would be difficult for me to operate without that.
Yeah, no, I totally relate to that. I'm a big fan of getting up early and working out before work. Having said that, while I am completely energetic and buzzing by the time I get into the office, I still enjoy a mid morning coffee. Not to wake me up,
Yeah.
more so for the social aspects, getting out of the office,
Yeah.
having a quick chat with the barista, and I like the
Sure.
taste as well. But yeah,
Yeah.
exercising early morning definitely gets you in the right frame of mind, both physically and mentally, to perform.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
where can our audience go to find out a little bit more about you, Paul, and connect?
Yeah, thanks. So probably the best place is my website, which is leadwithastory.com. And you
Hmm.
can find all my books on there, and the training courses I teach, and I do some podcasts and newsletters and things like that. It's all there.
Fantastic. We'll add that to the show notes for our listeners. So, look, thanks again, Paul, for giving up a little bit of your Sunday evening to speak to me today. You've provided our audience with a wealth of insights. I'm sure they'll get a copy of your book, as I'm definitely going to get a copy. I need to know what these 25 stories are that I must tell. So and there you go. You've built some suspense, some anticipation. You haven't told the whole story, so I need to know the answers. But
Very good.
thanks again, Paul. You've been an awesome guest.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure to be on.
Cheers. Hey guys, it's Steve again. If you're picking up what we're putting down, we'd love it if you took just a minute of your time to like, share, or subscribe to Future Squared on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. It would mean a hell of a lot to the team here who work effortlessly to bring you thought leaders and experts on topics of corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement on a weekly basis. As always, you can find more resources on innovation, including blogs, books, podcasts, videos, webinars, and tools at www.collectivecamp.us. If you'd like to connect with me on Twitter, you can do so at Steve Glaveski. That's Glaveski. Until next time, keep innovating. Future Squared out.